Hey guys, this is Mr. O'Brien here, and in this topic 3 video, we're going to be talking about cellular respiration. So this is part 4 of your notes PowerPoints. Now in this one, we're going to compare the basic transformation of energy during cellular respiration. Now remember, cellular respiration, the ultimate goal of this is produce our molecule of ATP, or our molecule of energy. Now in this case, we're taking glucose, which is our sugar molecule, and we're converting it into energy in the form of ATP. Now, ATP is important because it's responsible for all of our cellular energy. Now, it doesn't matter if it's prokaryotic or eukaryotic, all organisms use ATP as their energy source. Now, we just ended up talking, or we just stopped talking about photosynthesis. Now, if you remember, photosynthesis, we're taking CO2, carbon dioxide, H2O, water, and we're inputting energy in the form of light, and we're making glucose and oxygen. Now, in aerobic respiration, that's when we have oxygen, we're taking glucose plus oxygen and converting it into CO2, carbon dioxide, and water, and we're making our energy source, which is our form of ATP. Now, what you'll notice is the products of photosynthesis, or what we end with, are the reactants of cellular respiration. And the reactants, or what we start with of photosynthesis, are what we end with in aerobic respiration. So in other words, these two reactions are connected. Okay, reactants of one are the products of the other. The products of one are the reactants of the other. They're interconnected. So cellular respiration is simply the process by which cells obtain energy from carbohydrates. Now, if you remember, those carbohydrates we're talking about is glucose. Cellular respiration is a major way organisms harness energy, and they make ATP. So in other words, every second, every minute, you are breathing. And what you're breathing in is oxygen, and what you're breathing out is CO2. Now, this gas exchange occurs in our lungs. But what happens is this oxygen is used inside of our mitochondria, which is where the majority of our ATP is made, to make ATP from sugar. So again, this whole process occurs inside of your body without you even noting. So again, the equation here, so we have glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide, water, and energy, which again is our ATP. Now the steps of cellular respiration are a little bit different depending if we have or don't have oxygen. Now, when oxygen is present, we call this aerobic respiration. And this is where the majority of our ATP is produced. Now, when we're in an anaerobic situation, we have no O2. So in other words, no oxygen is present, and our body is working a lot harder to fulfill its ATP needs. So like I said, aerobic respiration occurs when oxygen is present in the body and creates much more ATP. To be specific, it produces 36 ATP from one molecule of glucose. Now, anaerobic respiration occurs when there is no oxygen, and really all that's produced here are 2 ATP, but what we're trying to do is keep glycolysis running, produce a small amount of ATP so that our body doesn't completely shut down. So let's talk about aerobic respiration first. Now, aerobic respiration is composed of 3 parts: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Now, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain occur in the mitochondria. Now remember, the mitochondria is a very important organelle. So this right here is our mitochondria down here. This is where the majority of ATP is produced. It's an organelle responsible for producing energy, especially, well, actually it's in both plants and animal cells. So let's go through the steps of aerobic respiration. The first step that we have is glycolysis. Now, in glycolysis, we actually have 2 steps of this. We have what's known as the investment stage, and the investment stage we have to input 2 molecules of ATP. And those 2 molecules of ATP are needed to split our glucose molecule into 2 3-carbon pyruvates. So these 2 pyruvates are then needed to go into the next step. So the payoff stage, there is a production of 4 molecules of ATP, which is 2 net ATP total, and 2 molecules of NADH as pyruvate is converted to pyruvic acid. Now, pyruvic acid is important because that is the molecule that enters into the Krebs cycle one at a time. So again, during glycolysis, 2 ATP are produced. So that means 2 molecules of energy in glycolysis. Now, glycolysis is the only step that can actually occur in an anaerobic situation, but the next 2 must have oxygen. So pyruvic acid must find its way into the mitochondria. And to do this, pyruvic acid combines with a molecule or a protein called coenzyme A. And what it does is it makes acetyl-CoA, and this helps transport the molecule into the mitochondria where it is needed in the next step. So again, we've entered into the mitochondria, and we are going into what's known as the citric acid cycle. So acetyl-CoA obviously just entered into the cell. So this 2-carbon molecule of acetate joins with another 4-carbon molecule already present to make citric acid, which is why this process is called the citric acid cycle. So we create this 6-carbon molecule of citric acid, and as we break that back down into a 4-carbon molecule, we start producing NADH, ATP, and eventually we create 2 molecules of ATP and 2 molecules of CO2. So this is the process where CO2 is released into the atmosphere. So this is when the oxygen that we breathe in and then we breathe out CO2 comes from. So citric acid proceeds through a series of steps that converts it back to that original 4-carbon molecule. Those 2 molecules of extra carbon are converted into CO2. So energy released by breaking these bonds during this process is captured to form ATP, NADH, and FADH2. Now, NADH and FADH2, they have hydrogens attached, and those are going to become very important during the electron transport chain and during ATP production. So again, the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain occur in the mitochondria. Now, often you hear of the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell because the mitochondria makes, if I could write, it makes energy. So again, this is where our energy is made inside of the cell. So the electron transport chain is a series of steps that creates a very high concentration, of hydrogens outside of this membrane. And what happens is those are then transported through this molecule called ATP, or the protein called ATP synthase. So the electron transport chain, a series of molecules through which electrons pass in a process that causes hydrogen to build up on one side of the membrane to produce ATP. Now, ATP synthase is an enzyme that creates the energy molecule ATP. So what happens here is this molecule of ATP synthase is almost like a turbine. So this turbine, these hydrogen ions flow through this turbine, and this begins to spin. Now, as it spins, ATP is being produced from ADP. So ADP, the energy to revitalize it is while this thing spins and converts that into ATP. Now, in this step, during the electron transport chain, we create a grand total of 36 ATP. So again, this is where the majority of our ATP is produced. So again, just to kind of review, during this process, it creates a high concentration of hydrogen molecules, which then flow through this ATP synthase. This creates that spinning of the turbine effect to create our ATP. And to kind of review here, this is what our mitochondria looks like. Remember, our organelle. Notice how there are all these folds on the inside. So those folds are called the cristae. And these folds, what they do is they create surface area. And the more surface area there is inside of the mitochondria, that equals more ATP because there's more locations for ATP to be produced. Now, anaerobic respiration, again, remember, is when no oxygen is present. So, like, this is when you're working out extremely hard and you're using all the oxygen in your body. Now, again, in this process, we're going only through 2 steps. Again, this is more primitive. This is probably what prokaryotes did first in order to create their ATP. So, again, we first go through glycolysis and we produce 2 molecules of ATP to produce pyruvic acid. We then use that pyruvic acid to go through what's known as fermentation. Now, in you guys, like when you're running, using up all your oxygen, it occurs in like your muscles, and you create what's known as lactic acid, which is the burning in your legs that it kind of makes your legs tired. But really what the overall goal of fermentation is to create NAD plus to keep glycolysis running to produce a small amount of ATP. So again, glucose is still our starting material and we're still going through glycolysis. Again, we are converting that into pyruvate, where eventually, if we have no oxygen, we go through either lactic acid or in like yeast, we go through ethanol fermentation. If oxygen is present, this enters into the mitochondria where oxidative phosphorylation, more specifically ATP production, occurs. So notice, large amount of ATP when oxygen is present, small amount of ATP when there's no oxygen. So again, remember, fermentation is the breakdown of carbohydrates by enzymes, bacteria, yeast, or mold in the absence of oxygen. Now, some common foods that use this fermentation process are things like yogurt. That's what gives it its tang. Kimchi, which is almost like a Japanese cabbage, spicy cabbage. Sauerkraut, more of our region, kind of Polish type food, and well as kefir, which is almost like a fermented type thing. But again, fermentation is in the absence of oxygen. So the first type we have is alcoholic fermentation, and this occurs in your bread, wine, yeast. Got a spelling here, so bread, wine, and yeast. So again, the anaerobic process by which yeast and other microorganisms break down that sugar. And if you ever look inside of a piece of bread, you'll notice that there's like almost looks like air bubbles. And what that is actually CO2 being formed while that yeast is eating the sugar. Now, the one that's more probably common to you is lactic acid fermentation. So this is the chemical breakdown of carbohydrates, obviously glucose, that produces lactic acid as its main end product. So what this does is it makes your muscles tired. So think about when you're running a mile. About halfway through, your legs start to burn. And what's happening is your body is becoming very low on oxygen. And it can't make ATP in its high amounts in the mitochondria. So it has to go through glycolysis. It has to go through fermentation, which produces a stinging lactic acid inside of your muscles. It makes your muscles tired. It's pretty much your body telling you, stop running so hard or you're going to hurt yourself. So what we should take home from this is in cellular respiration, the reverse reaction is photosynthesis. So if the arrow is pointing this way, okay, that's cellular respiration. Well, if we go the other way, and the arrow goes this way, and we add a little bit of sunlight, now all of a sudden we're doing photosynthesis. So again, this reaction, depending on which way the arrow goes, is what we're looking at. So the take-home message here is, during photosynthesis, we're producing glucose and oxygen. That glucose and oxygen enters into an animal's body, more specifically the mitochondria, where large amounts of ATP are produced. And what is given off by the animal is carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide and water enters into photosynthesis. So, in other words, the products of one reaction are the reactants of the other. So these two biochemical reactions, and that's a big word there, biochemical reactions are kind of related in that they need the other ones in order to function. So again, if you remember, photosynthesis produces ATP to make sugar from sunlight, produces glucose and oxygen. Okay, then cellular respiration takes that glucose and oxygen to make large amounts of ATP or cellular energy and gives off carbon dioxide and water, which then enter back into photosynthesis. So hopefully this video helps you out. Again, this is cellular respiration that occurs in the mitochondria to produce large amounts of ATP. Hopefully this helps you out. This is Mr. O'Brien, and good luck with